They were told the Americans were amateurs at war, industrial giants perhaps, but naval neophytes who had stumbled into a conflict beyond their comprehension. The German naval officers who found themselves captured in the Atlantic campaigns of 1943 and 1944 had been raised on stories of Jutland, of the Kaiser's fleet, of a maritime tradition stretching back centuries through Prussian discipline and European mastery of the seas. But when they were brought aboard American vessels as prisoners, when they descended into the machinery spaces and walked the corridors of these ships, their certainty crumbled like wet paper. What they encountered was not the hasty improvisation of a young nation playing at naval power. It was something their training had not prepared them for, something that violated every assumption about how wars were won and how nations built their instruments of destruction. The ships themselves seemed impossible. Too many of them, too quickly built, too advanced in ways that defied the resource constraints and time limitations that governed all military logic as they understood it. And it was not just the quantity, though the sheer scale was staggering enough. It was the quality, the innovation, the casual genius embedded in systems they had never imagined possible. Their minds could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew about the American capacity for naval warfare. Captain Heinrich Müller stood on the deck of the destroyer escort that had plucked him from the frigid Atlantic waters after his U-boat went down. The spray hit his face, salt stinging the cuts around his eyes, and he watched the way this small vessel cut through 6-foot swells with barely a shudder. He had commanded submarines for 3 years, had studied every class of Allied warship in the intelligence briefings, but this ship moved wrong. It responded too quickly. The vibration under his feet was smoother than anything he'd experienced on German destroyers twice this size. When the American sailors hustled him below deck, out of the November wind, he found himself counting rivets, counting welds, counting the impossible smoothness of prefabricated sections that fit together with tolerances his own Navy's shipyards could never achieve. The machinery space was warm, almost uncomfortably so, and the smell of oil and hot metal mixed with something else, fresh paint, rubber, the distinctive chemical scent of new equipment. Müller had expected the cramped chaos of a warship built in haste, the inevitable compromises of emergency construction. Instead, he walked through spaces that seemed designed by men who had reconsidered every assumption about how a ship should be built. The diesel engines hummed with a precision that spoke of mass production so refined it had achieved what craftsmen could not. Each engine mount, each pipe fitting, each electrical junction box was identical to the next. Not similar, identical. As if they had been stamped from molds by machines that never tired, never made errors, never introduced the human variation that marked every vessel in the Kriegsmarine. They had been taught that American industry was crude, capable of vast output but lacking the engineering sophistication of German design. But here, in this destroyer escort that had been launched just 8 months ago, 8 months from keel laying to combat operations, Müller saw the opposite of crudeness. He saw a philosophy of construction that his Navy had never considered. The Americans had not tried to build perfect ships the way German engineers understood perfection. They had built ships that could be replicated endlessly, ships whose every component could be manufactured in one plant and assembled in another, ships that could be maintained by ordinary sailors rather than specialized technicians. The genius was not in any single innovation but in the system itself, in the recognition that perfection at scale required abandoning the very idea of handcrafted excellence. The young American ensign who processed his personal effects spoke to him in halting German, apologizing for the cramped quarters. Müller wanted to laugh, or perhaps weep. Cramped? This prisoner hold was larger than the wardroom on his submarine. The bunks had mattresses. The ventilation worked. The lights ran off generators so reliable he could already tell they never flickered. But it was the small details that accumulated in his mind, like evidence in a prosecution he was conducting against his own assumptions. The door hinges were stamped steel, not cast bronze, yet they swung more smoothly than the carefully machined fittings on his submarine. The deck plates were welded, not bolted, Yet they didn't leak or rattle. The electrical switches were plastic, not bakelite or ceramic, and they numbered in the hundreds throughout the ship. Plastic. The Americans had somehow solved the manufacturing challenge of electrical-grade plastic at such scale that they could use it for applications the German Navy still reserved for more traditional materials. When they brought him to the captain's cabin for interrogation, Mueller passed through the Combat Information Center. He slowed his pace despite the guard's gentle prodding, trying to absorb what he was seeing. The radar display glowed with steady green light, showing returns from a convoy 30 miles distant. Radar was no surprise. The Germans had it too, though never with this clarity, never with this range at such small antenna sizes. But surrounding the radar station was an array of equipment that seemed to flow together, integrated in ways that suggested a completely different philosophy of combat coordination. Radio sets, plotting tables, target solutions, all positioned so that information flowed from one station to the next with minimal human translation. He recognized it for what it was. They had built not just better individual components but better connections between them. The Americans had looked at the problem of naval warfare and decided that the limiting factor was not weapon power or armor or speed, but information processing. They had built ships whose nervous systems responded faster than the men who crewed them. The interrogation was polite, almost gentle. The American intelligence officer offered him coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz grain mixture that had become standard aboard German vessels, and asked questions to which Mueller gave only his name, rank, and service number. But the officer seemed unsurprised, even respectful of his silence. They spoke of sailing, of the sea, of anything but the war, and when the session ended, the officer gave him a cigarette. An American cigarette, fresh tobacco rolled in paper so white it seemed to glow in the overhead lights. Mueller smoked it slowly, tasting the luxury of it, and wondered what kind of nation could afford such abundance for its military personnel. In Germany, even officers struggled to find decent tobacco. Here, an enemy prisoner was offered cigarettes as if they cost nothing at all. That night, Mueller lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of the ship. The hull sang differently than German steel, a higher pitch, a different resonance. Through the bulkhead, he could hear American sailors talking, laughing, complaining about the food. He had eaten better that evening than he had in 6 months of submarine patrols. Meat, vegetables, bread that was soft and fresh. The Americans apologized that the menu was limited, that the destroyer escort was too small for a proper galley. Limited. His last meal aboard his submarine had been black bread and tinned fish, and they called their feast limited. He thought about the propaganda he had read, the newsreels about American weakness and decadence. He thought about the reports from naval intelligence that described American shipyards as chaotic, American designs as derivative, American sailors as undisciplined. Everything he was experiencing contradicted these assessments. But the contradiction went deeper than simple misinformation. It suggested that the entire German understanding of what made a navy powerful was flawed. They had believed in the superiority of individual ships, of concentrated force, of technological perfection in limited numbers. The Americans had built something else entirely. A system of adequate ships produced in overwhelming numbers, each ship good enough, reliable enough, and above all, replaceable. Over the following days, as the destroyer escort rejoined its convoy and began the transit to a mainland port, Mueller observed everything. He watched the crew work, noting how young they were, how recently trained, yet how competently they performed their duties. The chief engineer was 23 years old. 23. In the German Navy, a man that age would still be a junior officer learning his trade. Yet this boy managed a power plant that would have been considered sophisticated on ships twice this size, and he did it with the casual confidence of someone who had been trained not just in operation but in maintenance, in troubleshooting, in the kind of systematic thinking that German engineers reserved for specialized technicians. The ship's routine was different too. There was discipline, certainly, but it was relaxed in ways that would have shocked a German captain. Officers and men ate different food, but the difference was minimal. The crew had recreation time, music, access to comfortable spaces. The American captain walked the deck without ceremony, spoke to ordinary seamen, listened to complaints. Muller had been taught this was weakness, this blurring of the rigid hierarchy that defined proper military order. But he watched the crew respond when the captain gave orders, saw the speed and precision of their actions, and understood that he was witnessing a different kind of discipline entirely. These men worked efficiently not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in their mission, because they were treated as valuable, because the system respected them enough to make their lives bearable. The radar mast was perhaps the innovation that haunted Mueller most persistently. He had seen German radar, bulky and temperamental, requiring constant adjustment by trained technicians. The American system on this small escort vessel was more advanced than equipment on German heavy cruisers. The antenna was smaller, the display clearer, the range extraordinary. But what troubled him most was not the technological superiority. Technology could be copied, given time and resources. What troubled him was the implication that somewhere in America, engineers and scientists were working on radar development with resources and freedom that his nation could never match. The antenna alone represented thousands of hours of research, hundreds of prototype iterations, manufacturing processes that required specialized facilities. And this was just one destroyer escort. There were hundreds of such ships. Each one carried technology that represented an investment in research and development that exceeded the entire German naval budget. He began to understand something that chilled him more than the Atlantic wind. The Americans were not fighting the same war as Germany. They were fighting a war of industrial systems, of production capacity, of innovation at scale. Every ship was a data point in a vast experiment. Every engagement fed information back to designers who could modify, improve, iterate. The German Navy built ships in small batches, each class representing years of design work, each vessel a carefully crafted instrument. The Americans built ships in series like automobiles, and when they discovered improvements, they incorporated them into the next batch while the current production run was still being completed. It was not artisanship. It was industrial evolution happening at a pace that made traditional naval development obsolete. When they reached port, Norfolk, Virginia, Mueller would learn later, he stood on deck as tugs guided the destroyer escort to the pier. The harbor was full of ships, not just full, choked with vessels, destroyers, destroyer escorts, patrol craft, minesweepers, cargo ships, tankers, landing craft, each one new or nearly new, each one representing construction completed in the last year. He tried to count them and gave up after 50. The piers themselves were industrialized spaces, with cranes and machinery and supplies stacked in organized rows that stretched as far as he could see. This was just one port. Norfolk was important, certainly, but it was not the only American naval base. There were others: San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, Philadelphia, each one turning out ships at rates that defied comprehension. The prison camp was inland, and the train journey there gave Mueller his first view of America beyond the immediate military zone. He watched through the window as the Virginia countryside passed, seeing farms and towns and factories. The factories especially drew his attention. They ran day and night, smoke rising from stacks, parking lots full of workers' automobiles. The workers at these factories owned cars. In Germany, car ownership was a luxury reserved for the professional classes. Here, factory workers drove themselves to their shifts. The economic implications were staggering. A nation where ordinary laborers earned enough to own automobiles was a nation with a productivity advantage that went beyond mere industrial capacity. It was an advantage in living standards, in education, in the kind of social stability that allowed long-term planning. The prison camp was clean and organized, and the German officers held there shared information in hushed evening conversations. Others had seen more, had been held on larger ships, had toured different facilities as they were processed through the prisoner system. Their stories accumulated into a mosaic of American capability that exceeded anything German intelligence had reported. Aircraft carriers built in months rather than years. Submarines constructed with welded hulls that could dive deeper and survive damage that would sink German boats. Fire control systems that could hit targets in darkness and weather that made German optical rangefinders useless. And everywhere, the same pattern: mass production of sophisticated systems, innovation distributed across thousands of engineers, continuous improvement based on operational feedback. One evening, an older officer, a captain who had commanded destroyers in the North Sea, spoke quietly about what he had seen. "They have built a navy in 3 years that is larger and more capable than anything Europe has produced in a century," he said. And they did it while simultaneously building the largest air force in the world and equipping armies fighting on 3 continents. The mathematics of it are impossible, yet here we sit. He paused, smoking one of the American cigarettes they were rationed weekly. "We were not defeated by better sailors or better tactics. We were defeated by a civilization that organized itself for war more effectively than we organized ourselves for peace." Mueller thought about the ships he had seen, about the destroyer escort and its casual technological superiority. He thought about the young crew members and their competent professionalism. He thought about the radar masts and the plastic switches and the stamped steel hinges. None of it was individually revolutionary. The Germans had most of these technologies, at least in prototype, but the Americans had made them routine, had embedded them in systems that worked reliably, had produced them at scale. The innovation was not in invention but in application, in the social and industrial organization that could take good ideas and turn them into millions of functional components installed on thousands of operational vessels. The deeper insight troubled him more. The Americans had rethought the fundamental nature of naval power. For centuries, navies had been built around the concept of the capital ship, the battleship, the heavy cruiser, the vessel whose individual power dominated the seas. The Americans had built those ships too, impressive ones, but they had also built something else, a network of smaller vessels so numerous and so capable that they could be everywhere at once. The destroyer escorts were not meant to win dramatic battles. They were meant to patrol convoy routes, to hunt submarines, to provide coverage across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Each one was expendable in isolation, but the network they created was not. Sink one destroyer escort and 3 more would take its place. The German Navy had built submarines to hunt individual ships. The Americans had built a system to make that hunting impossible. At night, Mueller wrote letters to his wife that he knew would be censored but which he wrote anyway. He tried to describe what he was feeling without revealing information that might compromise German naval intelligence. "I have seen things that have changed my understanding of the world," he wrote. "The nation we are fighting is not what we were told. They have resources, yes, but more than that, they have a way of thinking about problems that is different from ours. They build not just machines but systems. They fight not just battles but campaigns of production. I do not know if I am explaining this clearly, even to myself. The seasons changed. Winter gave way to spring. The prison camp filled with more officers, more enlisted men, more survivors of the Atlantic War. They compared experiences and found the same pattern repeated everywhere. American ships appearing in numbers that should have been impossible. American technology advancing at rates that suggested unlimited research capacity. American sailors who were young and inexperienced but trained to operate complex systems with reliable competence. The cumulative evidence pointed to a conclusion that some refused to accept and others stated openly: Germany had never had a chance. Not because German sailors were inferior or German designs were bad, but because the industrial and organizational advantages of the United States were so overwhelming that tactical and operational excellence could not overcome them. Mueller found himself thinking often about that first destroyer escort, about the smooth hum of its engines and the green glow of its radar display. He thought about the young ensign who had apologized for cramped quarters and the intelligence officer who had offered him coffee and cigarettes. These were not cruel people, or even particularly impressive individuals. They were ordinary men doing ordinary work within an extraordinary system. That was perhaps the most devastating realization of all. American naval superiority did not depend on exceptional genius or heroic effort. It was the product of normal people working within industrial and organizational structures that functioned with efficient reliability. The atomic bombs that ended the war came as news that reached the prison camp through official announcements. Mueller listened to the description of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and felt a kind of numbed recognition. Of course, the Americans had developed atomic weapons. Of course, they had done it while simultaneously fighting a global war. The pattern was consistent with everything else he had observed. The nation that could produce destroyer escorts in 8 months and carriers in 18 months could also organize the scientific and industrial resources to split the atom. The innovation was not the physics. German scientists understood nuclear fission, but the ability to translate theoretical knowledge into operational weapons through industrial programs of staggering scope. In the years after his repatriation, after he returned to a ruined Germany and rebuilt a quiet life far from the sea, Mueller often thought about those days aboard the American destroyer escort. He thought about how completely his understanding of naval warfare had been overturned by simple observation. The ships themselves were not the innovation that mattered most, though they were impressive enough. The true innovation was in how America had organized itself to produce those ships, how it had created educational systems to train the engineers who designed them and the workers who built them, how it had established research institutions that could generate continuous improvements, how it had built an economy that could supply the raw materials and the labor and the capital all at once without breaking. He had been shocked, yes, that first day when he descended into the machinery spaces of that destroyer escort. But the shock had deepened over time into something more profound than surprise. It was a kind of philosophical recognition that the rules of the game had changed, that industrial modernity had transformed warfare in ways that traditional military thinking could not grasp. The nation that could mass-produce sophisticated technology and embed it in resilient systems would dominate. Individual brilliance, tactical excellence, strategic genius, these things still mattered, but they mattered less than the capacity to sustain high levels of quality across vast scales of production. Sometimes he wondered if the young American sailors he had met ever thought about their work the way he thought about it. Probably not. They had been living inside the system, executing their roles, doing what seemed normal and necessary, only from outside, only from the perspective of someone whose entire worldview had been built on different assumptions. Could the revolutionary nature of that system become visible? The Americans had not just built better ships. They had built better processes for building ships, better methods for training sailors, better systems for integrating technology and tactics and logistics. And they had done it with a casual efficiency that suggested reserves of capability they had not even needed to fully deploy. The ocean did not care about innovation or industrial capacity or systems theory. It moved according to ancient patterns, cold and indifferent to human struggle. But the men who crossed those waters in steel vessels, who fought and died in the Atlantic campaigns, they lived and died according to the tools their nations could provide them. Mueller had gone to sea in a submarine that represented the peak of German engineering, a vessel built with precision and crewed with skill, and it had not been enough. Not because he or his crew had failed, but because they were fighting against an opponent who had reconsidered the fundamental nature of naval power and rebuilt everything from first principles. There were thousands of stories like this, thousands of moments when certainty met contradiction and collapsed into new understanding, and they are waiting to be remembered.